All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is David Smooke, and David is the founder and CEO of Hacker Noon. David, thanks for being here.
Hey, excited for this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we talked before, we kind of scheduled this podcast before the breaking news of the FTC coming to break up Facebook, which is one of the things that we'll get into in this kind of hour-long discussion about the state of media today. But before we kind of dive into the media at large, I'd love to give listeners a brief background, if you will, on Hacker Noon and what you guys are doing there.
Cool. So Hacker Noon is a technology publishing site. We have our own software, that content management system, and we publish everything from AI to software development, cryptocurrencies, startups. We recently released tech company news pages. So kind of connecting with the big news API to filter stories around the web, in addition to the stories on Hacker Noon and their business information. So just trying to be a better hub for technologists to read, write, and learn, and publish.
Cool. And I've seen some of your recent podcasts, and including the one with Web Profits. And in that one, you talked about how in the VC world, how tech companies get maybe that 10x valuation, whereas publishers tend to get more of a 3x valuation. Can you speak to why you think that is? I know in your podcast you mentioned that it's because potentially Hacker Noon could use your underlying technology to roll out different sites that maybe go after different audiences, and that you could just quickly boot up new sites. But what do you think is really behind that? How do you see it?
Well, software scales. I mean, and 10x is even low. Look at what Slack just did. You know, Slack selling to Salesforce at like, what was it, like 25 or something revenue? Like, yeah. So I guess I was not being as optimistic as the market is. And Airbnb goes public and, goes up 112% in a day. Like the idea of how software companies are eating the internet and, consuming the economy and everything is connected to them. You can't run a business now without software it's almost true. It's very close to true. I mean, maybe if you're selling shoes or if you're selling shoes online, you're stuck in the same boat, but if you're, maybe if I, when this is all said and done, I'll create a little food stand and then I'll still be taking my online orders through the software. So I think, the eating the world phrase gets, thrown around and abused a lot, but it's real. Like it's just every aspect of business almost can be made better with software. So I think that's where a lot of the optimism and pricing and valuations come from.
Yeah, and how have you taken Hacker Noon and built in more of a technology direction? What have you done to kind of make yourselves less of a publisher over time and more of a tech company?
Well, pay software developers is kind of the start. Who do you hire? What do they build? Why are they doing what they're doing? So our biggest budget is on software. Then we did, after the content management system, we did a voting software, and it's called the Noonies. So we had about 100,000 votes on it this year, and had sponsors and awards to give away domains, have some cash prizes. So really a system for community to vote. And there was this is the second year in a row we did it. So there's 2 instances of it now. And it was a lot of challenges of security, people gaming the system, how to figure it out. So that was kind of interesting. And once you go through those challenges, if someone else wants to do it, they have this, we've already gone through it. We started it because if we wanted to pay someone else and use their software for voting, and we looked around and they were all too pricey and didn't do what they want, and you can't iterate. You learn what people want as they use it, then you change the software, then the experience is better for the next person. So it's a better, experience if you control it in a lot of ways, or if you can, sometimes you're forcing stuff into the wrong software is a frustrating feeling. And then we're going to be taking that software to vote on different startups by location. So we're kind of testing it more with our own instances and our own environments, which makes a lot more sense because if it fails, it's on us. If it works, it's on us. And it's just not ready to go to, different communities, and you need dedicated people working on it. So it's been a fun way to change my job too. If the screen bothers me, or the way it works, or the way the layover works, or the way the pop-up works, you can change it. So it's I just feel more in control of my own destiny.
Right. And somewhat recently, one of those features that your team has built is this kind of emoji response around the articles, not just for the articles as a whole on Hacker Noon, but also even kind of line by line. How has that reaction been so far? Like, are people using it a lot? And I know you also designed it out of a little bit of frustration with some of the like and dislike type of features on other social media. So what was it that you tried to steer away from?
Yeah, so with these emoji reactions, you can do it at the story level or the character level. And we wanted to try and get to excuse me, the smallest unit of value that the reader can exchange to the writer. So where is it where you have to do the least amount of action to share the most amount of insight? So like a lot of the internet has been built up from up down or like, do not like, or voyeur or not, or don't engage, like engage or don't engage. So there's a lot of binary things about how pages work. So with the rise of emojis, I mean, you see it in Slack, enterprise stuff. Like once it makes it to enterprise software, it must really be a thing, because it like goes through the waves of consumers value it and then businesses value it. And it is fun, like that moment to react to your teammates on Slack. You're actually picking, you're not just saying, I endorse this. You're saying, this is keeping it 100. You're saying, this is exclamation points. You're saying, this is a fire. This is a bomb. There's like elements there that with the same amount of actions on the giver's side, the receiver gets so much more insight into what they're trying to convey. So I think that's been a good direction for the internet as a whole. And, Facebook has their 6, LinkedIn has their 6. So you're seeing it more on other social networks too. Not Twitter though, which is interesting. But for us, we want to get to where people are choosing their own emojis and then hopefully also building some of their own emojis and like getting to this, like, I can react to something in a way that's more authentic to myself. So for now, it's 4 default at the top and the bottom, or in line and at the top and the bottom. And we also made the choice to only have the downvote in line and not at the top of the story. So the top of the story, you can't say this is bad because you haven't read it. But if you're in the content and you're reading it, you can say this is bad. You can't say, I disagree with this. You wrote it poorly. You have an error. You're wrong. You're dumb. Like, there is value in like saying no. So, but you don't want that to get like abused, gamed, and bullied. We've tried other things, like we did some inline annotations and people used it to try and like harass people instead of even commenting on it. So we you kind of roll back and roll forth and like, what does the reader want? Sometimes the reader wants just the text and everything else is a distraction and it's away from, what you want. But other times it's like, depending what you're reading, where you're reading, when you're reading, like you want to know the URL, you want to know the author, you want to know how long will it take you to read it, you want to know how many likes it has, maybe not. So like there's things that I go back and forth with all the time of like how much context is good for a site and for an individual story to give the reader a better experience or not.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we're going to be talking about for most of the podcast here is how we kind of overlay this context or this reader feedback across all of these different platforms. So obviously you're doing it with Hacker Noon. We're doing it on some level with Credder's review process. Like you called out, Facebook has their 6 reactions. Twitter has their version of this kind of contextual layer. Let's dive into Facebook's for a second, because I think we can all kind of remember when it was pretty much just a like button, and then they rolled out these emotions. The cynic in me wants to say that they rolled it out in this kind of emotion state type of feedback loop, because that is actually how they decide which advertisements to show to users is based on maybe the emotion that they're trying to tweak or hit at that particular time. Would you say that it's somewhat about that, or do you think it's a mix of that and also just trying to give users a little bit more nuance in how they respond to a story?
Both. I mean, I think if Facebook's trying to target an ad, what emojis of the 6 you use may not be the best. Like they have so much data on us that like they probably have smarter systems to target our ads. So that even if they are nefarious in that manner, they probably are doing it in a smarter way. Because the emojis themselves, it's just 6 data points on one thing, and they know they pick the first one most of the time because it's convenient. So it's not like super insightful, or if like you see something is sad, it doesn't mean you want to have an ad for a funeral home, just because you reacted to your friend dying. Like that's not a good correlation of how to sell stuff or how to curate content in general. I mean, I wish that yeah, I don't know what's going to happen to them. They've kind of changed it. Like they've put so much of the world online. If you take like a longer view of their impact on the world and longer term, but with these new stuff in terms of forget like the intent of the software or the intent of the business. Like where I come from is like sometimes when companies get too large, it's a problem, and there's there's more of these things start to circle of bad behavior because there's not a competitor the user can turn to. So that's where like social networks have been such an interesting case study because they only work if you already won. They only work if you have the people in. Like everything if you were to, I do this sometimes, go back and be a new time user and start the social network. Watch how many software choices and prying and walking throughs they do to try and get you to 10 friends. Mm-hmm. It's like without it, the software is useless. So it's really hard to move around. Like if me and you want to go move over to a new social network, our past interactions are gone. I thought that was between me and you. I thought that's something at least one of us owned. Isn't that true? But if I go over there, it's gone. So there's a lot of frustrating ones. The other one I keep coming back to, not to leave Facebook, but my Amazon seller data, I feel like that should be something like I could transport and just say, hey, do you have any of these goods at a lower price? 2 clicks, let me see, do you have any of them? Like that, like that's something where like if the customer truly owned their data and could move it around, competition would go up in a good way. And, you would be able to interact with more businesses that can either do a better price or better quality.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're seeing the FTC go after Facebook right now is because they would probably agree that Facebook has gotten too big and has that the social media environment has become a little anti-competitive. And what they're in particular looking at is the acquisition of Instagram for $1 billion, and then pretty soon after the acquisition of WhatsApp for $19 billion. 2 up-and-coming startups, like tangentially related to Facebook's platform, but definitely a potential threat if, given the freedom to continue expanding. What do you think about these acquisitions? So I guess let me hone in the question. The FTC approved these acquisitions in the past, and now they're coming back in some ways because of the success that Facebook has had in kind of adopting these and bringing them into the fold. Is this fair to make a ruling and then reverse course?
That's the government, right? They can change their mind whenever they want.
But it does set up a new precedent in a way.
Yeah. I'm definitely watching it. It's going to be really curious how this plays out. And looking back at Instagram, I mean, when they bought it for $1 billion, they were made fun of. Like, circle the web. They just overpaid 13 people, like, just really making fun of them. And Instagram was this story of like, anyone can build an app, get 10 friends to work on it and sell it for $1 billion, and have this, everyone gets a nice payout. And it's like, that did work out well for them. And, the founders continued to build there for a while, and then it became more integrated and they left. And, the thing is so much bigger. And it's also so much bigger because they cross-pollinate, and they bring in a ton of users. So like saying it was like competitive at the time they bought it, it could have become competitive. At the time they bought it, the user numbers were so vastly different. Like Facebook just had so many more users. It's at the time they bought it, doesn't feel that competitive if you value it by total user volume, which like I saw some of the old emails of Mark Zuckerberg and his lawyers that broke, and he did acknowledge that if it reaches network effect, it can be a real competitor. And I'm trying to buy it before it reaches the network effect that it needs to be a true competitor. So he's admitting that it could become one, but he's also framing it, even in the leaked emails, of like, hey, right now it's not quite there, but it very well could be. So we're going to buy it. So that's like, I think that's kind of just true. And if the government deems that as anti-competitive, maybe they will start breaking stuff up.
Yeah, I think one of the other direct quotes was, it's better to buy them than have to compete, something like that.
Yeah, they were going to be saying that one a lot. That was going to be circulated everywhere.
Aren't all acquisitions in some ways strategic or anti-competitive? Because you're basically saying, look, this is something that even if they're not a direct competitor now, they could fit into our model, or they could potentially pivot into our space, and we're better off acquiring them and just becoming a larger company. So I guess aren't all acquisitions kind of somewhat anti-competitive and strategic in a way? This is going to be hard to prove.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like living is anti-dying. You know, like it's like, yeah. All business has strategy unless the person has no strategy behind them, which they're probably not going to be in business very long.
Yeah.
So there's yeah, because there's when you look at buying businesses, I think like sometimes people say, how do I buy it? Do nothing and just take the profits. That's like the kind of the old school, or like the asset accumulation, or more of the even private equity type of approach. Maybe they put their own person in to run it and keep the rest of it. And it's just like, hey, this business could make 100,000 a year, or I could buy it right now for $1 million and own it for 20 years and just keep. So there's like an element of that, but with technology and user volume, you know, the value a lot of times isn't in the direct revenue or profit. You know, it's in like, hey, if I had that, I can also make money over here. And you know, with social networks, like I think a lot of the way to think about these big tech companies is the control of identity, and who controls my identity and how do I manage it. And once you control the identity, you control how they interact with the digital world. So the battle that's really going on is log in with Facebook, log in with Google. And that's where like, once they have that user, they just do all their own little models of lifetime value across different verticals. And because you're using Gmail, you're also making money off of search, you know? So there's like some of it that like feels a little dirty, but if you try and get into their strategy and their incentive, like ask yourself the question, you know, how do they impact my identity? And how are they changing the way I interact with the internet? There's a lot to how to look at why these companies do what they do.
Yeah. Part of the FTC suit is claiming that these acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp are harmful to consumers, which you could argue the kind of aggregation of user data across these three platforms, you could argue that it's harmful, but I think Facebook will argue that it allows them to provide an even better customized, personalized experience, and that users don't have to visit the site, and they, you know, they're opting into the value. And then the other part of the suit is actually that they're claiming that it's harmful to advertisers, which first off is just kind of interesting to think that like the FTC is worried about protecting online advertisers. But I think Facebook has another strong argument to say that, look, actually the aggregation of the data across these three platforms is what allows us to be the cheapest, most targeted advertising platform in the world. So personally, I think that these are really hard. This is going to be a really hard case for the FTC to win, but with the government, you never know. Like they will steamroll their way, and if they're dead set on an outcome, they'll tend to get what they want. But my question for you is, do you think that it's possible that Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook, independent of each other, could actually in aggregate be worth more than what the Facebook brand is worth today?
Definitely. Once you have to make a decision for your business because of another business, it may not be the best decision for your business. So yeah, they could have all become bigger. I mean, WhatsApp, what was their first year pricing? It was like, get it for a year for like $1 or $5. They did some crazy low thing of like, just gather the credit card number, and had this massive army of low paying customers paying them directly. So like their early days were a pretty interesting model in terms of small payment, high value, shit ton of users, like pretty cool. Like that could have been bigger, but you know, these founders also look at it the other way, like, hey, there's a cash out point. And is this tons of customers paying you a tiny amount really what you want? Or do you want the, you know, billions of dollars that you get, you know, the moment you turn over the assets? So those incentives are always going to be at play. That means like selling a business isn't good or bad. It's just part of business, and it happens all the time. And it's a better outcome than it dying and disappearing. Or, you know, so there's that selfishness of who made it and what decisions do they want. I don't think everybody wants to build Patagonia and have a 100-year plan for their private business and have to worry about it and do all that work. That's pretty tough. So businesses start and end, and I think the internet makes businesses start faster, and in some ways it can make them end faster.
Yeah, Instagram getting bought out, and I think it was even less than a year, was quite insane. One thing that might play out here if WhatsApp and Instagram are kind of pulled out of Facebook is, I think that maybe the general public is going to think that that's a win. Like, okay, we've solved the problem. We're not as, the social media landscape isn't as centralized anymore. But what they're going to kind of quickly realize is that, well, the majority owner in those three individual companies, and probably the key decision maker, is still Mark Zuckerberg. He's just going to be operating them as three different like individual armies on the risk board.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to think about how Facebook has been trying to get in front of this. So if you follow some of their recent ads, where they basically say, they always now say from Facebook. So it's like Instagram, blah, 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 from Facebook. The Facebook family, this united brands, putting Facebook at the bottom of login screens. So they tried to like get in front of the idea that you don't know you're on Facebook, which is where the danger is. Because once you're on a site and it's actually you're on another site and you don't know it, you don't know what entity you're giving information to and what entity you're trusting with different things. So that's where like I think they have a decent argument, but I think Facebook knows that argument and they're trying to get in front of it. So there's like, and then as you're talking, the other thing I was thinking about is just how funny Alphabet is. It's like, that's Google. No, it's Alphabet. That's Google. No, it's Alphabet. Like the same problem with if you have the same stakeholders at multiple companies, it functions just like one company would. Like it's the same decision makers, levers, same people make money off of it. So these structures, like to me, I just keep coming back to competition. So like I think it would be more valuable if the government could say, if you have a certain number of users, you have to open source your newsfeed algorithm. And you have to be explicitly clear why every single item appears in this newsfeed. I think that is more value to the consumer than saying, I need to change the corporate structure of the organization because. So that's like, I come down more of like where regulation is, if regulation can prevent harm of people, that's better regulation than they're regulating it because they have some idea or ideology that they're trying to push forward, and the way this company does it is different. Because that part of it just seems less likely to help the end user or the citizen in this case.
Yeah, I do think there's an argument to be made that breaking Facebook up will make the space more competitive. Because personally, from running Credder and speaking with investors and that community, one of the major concerns is, okay, but what happens when Google or Facebook decides that they want to start reviewing the news and they just roll out the same feature to their existing platforms and cover all of the content platforms that you are trying to get onto? And I think that argument becomes a little less or that potential outcome becomes a little less threatening if they're all individual companies, because it seems like hopefully these startups in social media will have a better shot at getting out the gate. And another thing that might come about in this, or I guess is tangentially related, is the issue of Section 230 and that regulation around kind of the management of content on these platforms, publisher versus platform. This is a very nuanced issue, but do you have like a personal take on whether these platforms are publishers or what determines platform versus publisher?
How much money you have is sometimes, unfortunately, the answer. With Hacker Noon, I mean, we do the second human rule. So every story that's submitted gets 10 to 30 minutes from an editor. So we're both, a part of publishing this. At some level, if it's on your site, you have some level of responsibility for it. The content owner is the number one person that's responsible for what happens to this content. They're responsible for where they licensed it. They're responsible for how it hurts or helps people. If you write something great and you help 1 million people, you're responsible for that. And if a platform helped facilitate that reading and writing experience, they're the next person that's responsible. So we'll see how these play out. I mean, the 230 stuff gets really funny because it's like, if they were to switch that on Twitter, and Trump were to switch the law, and then he's liable for his own content, it's like, how's that gonna, like, isn't that gonna be worse for him? So there's like a circle of like, when you think about how to regulate the internet, it's less like this idea that they keep coming back to 230 and how to rewrite it. People interpret 230 so much differently. Like, it's not like saying, if I take this away, the whole internet's gonna be fixed. So there's, just really tough ones in there. And then as these, different publishers have all these different assets and they try and promote them on their own site. Like, is having a corporate blog illegal? Would it be like the idea that you're saying you're no longer neutral because Facebook also puts corporate blog posts on Facebook.com? That means they're producing content. Does the idea that Mark Zuckerberg produces content on Facebook.com as the majority shareholder of Facebook, does that mean Facebook has an opinion when he publishes those posts? So is he actually switching the entire narrative of that? The editorial line starts with the majority shareholder publishing on the site. So there's like nuance to it that like I don't know how it'll play out. But I think in the long-term history of the regulating the internet, I don't think 230 is the most important issue. I think it's a very popular issue right now, and we'll see, what happens with it. I didn't really understand what the executive order was. I didn't get it. I tried to read through it just to understand what it was, and I didn't understand what they were trying to achieve.
Do you think that something needs to be done about Section 230, or that there's so much nuance around it that you can't really properly regulate it without creating enormous legal barriers for other startups in the space? Is it necessary, or do users just get to decide which platforms they want to use based on how those platforms are, controlling the content?
I think if the government wants to come in and make a real difference about how the internet functions, it's about the ownership of your information and the portability and the accessibility of it. So mandating that Facebook has to manage the export of your data in a certain way. And so saying, hey, if there is an exact replica of Facebook, boom, another instance, someone clones the whole thing and it just has a better community to it. And you want to take all of your data and past interactions over, you can do it. So I think like if you're looking at trying to regulate things, I think open sourcing news feeds, understanding why news is distributed is one of my big ones. And then also the control of your data and moving it around to different platforms. Like those, I think are going to have much more positive long-term impacts on how we use the internet than this platform versus publisher debate.
Yeah, and you brought up a moment ago President Trump on Twitter. One of the things you and I wanted to discuss was this idea of how Twitter has been handling not just things like the New York Post article, but a presidential tweet, and whether there's this concept of if they are a world leader, therefore everything they say is newsworthy, and therefore everything should be unblocked. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, what kind of site do you want to be? They're pushing pretty hard for the public forum and saying, hey, Twitter is the public forum. And with that argument, I get it. I think if they wanted to say our impact on the world is we don't want to be the host of him, they could say it. They could do it in a second, and they could lose half their users. So like, that's a choice on them. I don't know what their interests are. It seems to be they want as many users as possible, and they'll make choices to get as many users as possible. And this is kind of where they came to. Whether how you add like context to something, where context and editorial run into each other is very tough, because they're not changing any of the content of the president's tweets, but they are choosing exactly what words are above or below it and saying, is this fact checked over here, or various versions of short text, 10 to 12 characters, to try and inform the reader that this may not be true. But at that point, maybe it comes back to giving the reader more control. Do you want that on your Twitter or not? The Blue Sky team, they're doing, waiting for something to drop, of like a decentralized Twitter and making Twitter more like, a protocol, and other people could have own social networks with their own rules, build a top to base, So I think that's kind of more exciting of niche communities, because like there's not a one size fits all here. More smaller sites with more portability of data and more of their own choice of how the software works would be a better internet for me. I would enjoy it more.
Would you say that Trump is Twitter's most valuable user?
I think he probably has been the user over the last 4 years that has created the most time on site. I think that's probably pretty close to factual. I don't know exactly how you could prove it without Twitter's data, but does that mean he's the most valuable? To me, no. To me, the most valuable one would probably be the CEO. Like that's the person making the choice of how this thing works, or at least he's responsible for all the choices of how it works. So that's how I would look at that.
Do you think that Twitter's going to handle Trump's posts differently when he's no longer president, or is the fact that he is a former president always going to give him the classification of like a newsworthy world leader?
That's interesting. I mean, because for life, they call him 44. 43. That's kind of the title they get for life, and they get Secret Service following them around. So like, how does our society treat them is kind of the first question. So with that, I would say probably once you're a former president, your words always hold a different weight. Even if you're painting pictures of your feet in the bathtub, it's still like a big deal. So there's that. But I mean, I did see stories breaking that they would consider banning him from the platform after he goes out of office, if he goes out of office. But I don't think they will. I think they've kind of already made their bed. I think if they wanted a different history of their company, they would have done it, and they would have done it when it mattered. If you do it now, and it also things of like, I don't know what their core metrics are. I don't know what they value. If they value just time on site, no, they shouldn't cut them off. That's their number one value. That'll play out that way. And then there's also back to competition. How big does Parler get? How big do these other competitors get? Because the moment, you say you lose all of his audience to another app, now the whole history of the trajectory of who gets the network effect, can change. And they can have an outlet where that decision could kill the company, which I don't think it would, but it could.
Yeah, I agree. I think that letting Trump go to a Parler or some other competitor is one of the biggest and maybe the only most direct threat to what Twitter's use case is right now. So let's dive into the kind of context adding onto these posts. Facebook's been doing it, especially around kind of COVID-19 content. There's been a lot of extra kind of fact checks and links to the CDC and the WHO. What do you think about just context as a solution to the problems we're seeing? Because I think most consumers agree that we don't want these platforms pulling down content on our behalf, and we don't want censorship to be the norm. But we also seem to agree that rampant misinformation, or the catch-all term of fake news, which I don't find very useful, but that term, that you can't just let that run rampant. Do you think that context and these kinds of overlay labels is a good compromise solution in general? Yeah,
I mean, context around content is important, and that you're going to get it kind of either way. Like the idea that it's purely blank, how did you get there? Context is also, it can be added to where you already are, but it also can be a part of how you got there and how you're leaving. And that those moments also add context. Like even as simple as for the longest time, I don't know if they still do this, but it drove me insane. When you leave Yelp to go to the business site, they just put this giant ad for Yelp and say, if this doesn't click through in whatever seconds, click here. It's like, dude, you're literally just stealing my time to say I was just there. The context you chose to add was reminder that you were here at Yelp gaining value about the business. Don't go to the business's site and gain value about the business. So those little moments, hopefully what I'm saying is they're very powerful and they can be good or bad. There's also elements of the auto drop down on Google search can be helpful for related questions. There's a lot of times, say you're searching for something fast, like how to get a tick out of your daughter's neck, for example, and you're looking around kind of playing these tweezers aren't strong enough, what are the related questions people add? And I ended up soaking in vinegar. If you basically soak something in vinegar and put it on the tick, you can get it out easier. And it was kind of interesting of how do you get because that really forced the moment of how do you get to the information the fastest? Because you're in a little bit of a panic. So you're looking at the size of this tick. You're it's not in that deep, but we can be fine. Take a deep breath. But you're also there's a tick in my daughter. I have to get it out. So it wasn't fully dire, moment, but it was just thinking about how to add context and related. I guess with the Trump stuff, and fact checking, if people are saying obviously fact things and distributing it to tens of millions of people, but what is obviously not fact? There's this element of everyone's in their own reality completely. We agree on some mutual things of facts, but we're in our own realities. There's a chance we're in a simulation. Who knows? It doesn't something being purely true fact is I exist. Is that a fact? Could I be, my own little artificial intelligence thing, and I'm just created by someone else and they're playing around? There's I don't know. So I think also with the context, social proof is what I think a lot more about, because you look at a retweet gets retweeted because it has a lot of retweets, so that was a weird thing of pushing onto viral, or it's good because it has 1,000 likes. And I do like that Instagram was at least one of the first, I think, of the majors to break that off and say, you can click through and see who liked it, but we're not going to put the number of likes right next to the content. And they rolled it out in various, speeds and people and whatever. I feel like sometimes I still see the numbers. Like I don't know. Like sometimes it appears, sometimes it doesn't, or maybe I've just been so trained. But that's also like, it would be really cool if the user could pick. It'd be cool if you could say, what context do I want, or more controls around that. I think Google will get better at it, and other companies will do it. And because sometimes, I would like to choose how context works. I think technology can get better about how they can let the user choose the context that gives value to them.
That's actually a great idea, and I'd never thought of that before. The idea of next to a post that has one of those contexts, having a little drop down where maybe there's a whole list of third-party context providers, and you can just opt in or opt out to certain ones. And for example, Credder could be one of those context layers that people could opt in or out of. That's really
that would
cool.
be a lot of different product options there, because it could be something that the network builds themselves, or like you're describing, where you're more of the third party, or even the browser. The browser is kind of really well positioned to do this, as they can, because they can build more of the customizations with top sites. Because the more you do it, you're going to have to really they switch one thing. There's just going to be so much maintenance and dependent on all these top sites, because they're not going to like you choosing your context. They're going to say, we already determined what context drives us money, so we want to keep that.
Yeah. What do you think about fact checkers in general? Because a lot of the contexts that we're seeing are these kind of fact checks that are attributed to a story in your feed. But we see from consumers, or at least this is my understanding from talking to users on Credder and just what I've been following in the space, is that the same kind of distrust that many news consumers have with media publications, they tend to see these fact checkers in a very similar light. In the same way that you're like, okay, why should I trust something that CNN tells me? They have the same kind of question or thought process towards, why should I trust what Snopes is telling me? How is that any different than my trust in one of these publications? Is that kind of your take on it as well, that people have a similar level of distrust around fact checkers?
I don't know if I'd go as far as you. As you were speaking, I kept thinking about all the depressing stories of the content moderators at the Facebook outsourcing company, and how sad they were, and just how doing that action demoralized their lives. So I think that it's tough. It's someone else's context. You're trying to create context for someone else, and there's always going to be error there. It's never going to be perfect. Trust with the individual entity, whether it's a site, a publication, what you're saying, if you distrust the fact checking they do on the site, you distrust the site. So that's where you put in your micro copy, where you say this is a statement from the company is a really thing that is a measure of brand trust. And Trump has created this crazy world, really truly remarkable, where you can get all of the users to distrust the platform and still use the platform to follow him. Well, I don't know how you do that. That's a pretty, it's like a hate watching a movie almost. I don't know if that's quite right, because you're not the same connection to it, but the distrust of news today is frustrating. That it's just people can't agree on sometimes what seem like basic things that we're 99% sure are true. And that's a little sad.
Yeah, I guess if we had the drop-down option that you mentioned, one of those options would be to select which fact checkers you would want to see fact checks from. And so
that's cool.
That could be another cool way of solving that problem. And what you said about Trump getting people to still use Twitter while encouraging them to kind of be angry at Twitter, we're seeing something kind of similar play out with the voting itself. He's saying that the voting is rigged, while still at the end of all of his speeches reminding his voters to get out and vote. And it's kind of interesting. Do you have any take on kind of the current situation that we're having in politics, and kind of the split of, it seems like what we're talking about, these kind of context and fact checks and the trust in media, a lot of it seems to stem from the fact that it seems like people are living in different worlds now, just different worlds completely as far as their information diets and what they believe to be true. Is this something that is just going to keep getting worse and worse as, you know, a documentary like The Social Dilemma kind of would present us that thesis?
The echo chamber, man. It's like what an echo chamber could be 20 years ago or 100 years ago, and what it can be now is just wild. You can get so much content about the exact point of view you already believe. It's just like that. So I think that's where a lot of these problems come to. And I mean, part of the incentives of like two-party systems also get me pretty frustrated in relation to this, because it's like, why does it have to be one or the other? And then if it has to be one or the other, a lot of times the solution is to hurt your opponent as opposed to help yourself. And that can gain you more votes. So that incentive creates a lot of problems for what content's put out, how ads are targeted, how messages are spent. What stories do you spend time scaling up? What do you spend money scaling up? And a lot of times the conclusion is that the boogeyman, you know, is more effective than the hero. And so that I'm hopeful, or if there were more than two parties, you're always going to have a number one competitor, I suppose. But if there's more than two parties, the incentive to tell more of why your story is the hero is much higher, because the cost of going after one of your competitors mean you don't go after the other three. So you're, you know, as opposed to if you put your effort, resource, and time into just why what you're doing is good, I think the world will be better.
Yeah. Sometimes with my guests, I like to give them bad business ideas. Like, I don't know if you know the show Nathan For You, where he comes up with these.
Actually, funny story about this. I used to work for a company called Smart Recruiters, and we would, the dev office was in Poland. So we'd, you know, travel back and forth as the team. And the game we came up with, it was just bad product ideas. And so as we're like going through all these planes, we're pitching each other. One of them that I'm remembering is it's the Frisbee plate. So you can bring it to, you know, your camp, you know, and as you're playing, you can throw your Frisbee, then boom, just flip it over, it's a plate. And like, just the whole thing is, it's just a Frisbee. It's like you call it a Frisbee plate and then say it's a good product. So yeah, I'm curious, what bad product do you want to pitch?
Well, first off, that Frisbee plate idea is great. I use it all the time. So you need to rethink that. But my bad business idea, as we're talking about kind of confirmation bias, is, again, bad business idea, is if Hacker Noon spun off like a second site, a sister site called like confirmmybias.com or something. And at the beginning of the user journey, you have people pick their positions on various issues. And then you just have some kind of a bot write out things that totally confirm their bias in a daily newsletter or something like that. Do you think that gained traction, even as a joke? It feels like the media environment is so ripe with confirmation bias that even as a joke, something like that could actually get traction.
Probably. I mean, definitely with people within the media kind of laughing about it, using it. I think to like really gain adoption, you have to find the viral echo chamber. And then it's actually the people that are gaining value that really want the echo chamber. And so then you start to look at how do you create a vertical that has that, but it doesn't sound like a rewarding. I mean, I guess one way to spin it is like, did you watch like the Some Good News channel with John Krasinski? The Office guy.
No.
He made it when the pandemic started. He did all these things about like, hey, I know the world sucks, but these are some amazing stories that are happening right now. People that are really uplifting the world. Like they actually ended up marrying, being the minister for a marriage on the spot for like these huge Office fans. So they did a lot of things of like kind of trying to be like emotional and like reach people digitally. So I think if you had like, what if you had an echo chamber for good news? That would be kind of fun, you know, of just like these huge uplifting stories. I mean, I think, what was it, Upworthy? You know, they kind of really played into that of like, you get a little 2-minute video and then donate or whatever they kind of did. But like, there can be some good things from a structure like that of like, because you do, some people, sometimes you just want good news and you don't want to like be filtered with reality and have to deal with some news is good and some news is bad. So I think there are spots that could be a little less dangerous.
Yeah, I think the reason that those types of good news platforms can will never be, in my opinion, as big as, you know, what we see elsewhere, is actually just about human psychology. I think a lot of the way we think, it comes down to survival and fear of loss aversion. And if that's the case, if that's always what we're trying to do, and we're trying to gain information to protect ourselves or survive or make better decisions, there's less perceived value or importance on good news or things that just make you feel better. So basically, I guess on a human psychic level, I think that's why this bad news gets so much more spread.
Yeah, I mean, also, like, quite literally, if you filter out the bad news, it's not news. Like, it's a site, and it has valuable group of stories and a type of stories that people can come back to. But if you want to be pure about covering the news, you don't choose, like, it's a bad way to choose. Like, just if it's negative or positive, I publish. If it's negative, I don't. Like, it's not a great way to, you're just not you're getting biased news. Imagine if you run a company and you just filter, you don't have any of the bugs or complaints, and you just go about your day thinking everything is going great just because you haven't listened to any of the problems, you know? So it's yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I like what you're doing in terms of looking around about how sites, how valuable, how trustworthy are they? How have you found, like, do people want to crowdsource that information? And is there any, like, behaviors that you, like, kind of look to play in where they don't explicitly give the information, but you can learn from a trend or a traffic flow or something else? Or is it always like, I want the reader to explicitly say, like, I trust or don't trust this story?
Yeah, so great question. So one of the ways that the Credder review process works is, it's not, although there is a 5-star scale, which is kind of traditional across review platforms in all industries, we have this follow-up question that essentially allows the user to label a specific thing that they found about the article, whether that's a type of logical fallacy or a bias or a mistake, or for some other, like, reason, like a catch-all category, like they're calling it out as satire or overly sensational. But in just 2 clicks, we let you tag a super specific thing you want to celebrate, like investigative, or something that you want to label it as negatively, like speculation. And so the idea there being that other readers can see at a glance what gained or lost that reader's trust, and that we can kind of create a lasting, trackable database of the authors and outlets, and kind of what it might be that are the flaws in their kind of publishing. And one of the things that we actually see, some people have concerns over Credder because they think, oh, but you're going to have right-wing people downvoting left-wing articles, and you're going to have left-wing people downvoting right-wing articles. And to a certain extent, that's true. But you could also argue that, well, there shouldn't be right and left-wing articles in general. So both of them should be downvoted. And what we actually see at Credder is that these articles that aren't taking a political stance and are doing their best to kind of just present the known facts at hand in a way that is, you know, chronological or makes sense to the reader, those are actually the articles that skate through unscathed and end up with those high 98 to 100% ratings. And that's really the goal of Credder, is to find the articles, authors, and outlets that both sides of the political spectrum can actually agree on. Because we might not be able to agree on individual facts, but if we can agree that, okay, this author outlet tends to be more credible because they're not playing the partisan games, then I can tend to trust their content a little bit more. And maybe we can start to, maybe not rebuild, because I'm not sure how much trust consumers have ever really had in media, but maybe we can build for the first time like a more trusting media environment. So that's the goal.
Cool. Yeah, it's a very interesting way to do it. I'd be very curious of, like, the 98 and 100s from the most biased sites. Like, what are the best articles on the most biased sites? That would be kind of like a really cool list that we could publish on Hacker Noon, or publish elsewhere. But the other thing that the direction you're headed that kind of interests me, it's related but not quite the same, is just pure quality. So there's, like, the element of true and false and trust or not, which is very binary. But in our business, a lot more of the Hacker Noon stories are expertise. And you're explaining how to build something, or you're giving an essay or an opinion, and it's just a lot more of, like, I know my job. You know, so there's that level of, like, where these review systems could get kind of exciting for us. It's more like, how good of a JavaScript developer are they? Then you can purely get to like where you're blogging on the internet, and that gives you job offers. And that's what happens. That's how a lot of people in tech, get their job, is from writing and putting out what they believe in and how they think and how they build. And that in turn, creates people that are interested in building those same type of things and paying for those same type of things. So with Hacker Noon, I mean, we break some news, but it's more the expertise stuff and how that content curation works, where I, spend more of my time thinking.
Yeah, and I know that even the way that you guys do advertising is more about this kind of content marketing as opposed to just a pure banner ad style marketing. Can you talk about what that looks like on your platform, what these kind of story or content focused advertisements look like? Because I agree, I think that that is the future, and that those types of advertisements are going to play best in the next 10 years.
Yeah, so one step we made, our decision, was to not just plug in Google Ads. Everyone that's advertising on Hacker Noon has a direct relationship with us. So there's no intermediary where there's no ad network where you're part of that pricing system and you're part of where does that information go system. So Google's done a great job to make it so easy to put in AdSense, but then now they have the internet data. They know what people do. They have the code on the site. They're everywhere. Facebook pixel everywhere. So that element I think is bad for competition. Like obviously if they have that much data, they can price cheaper. They can do different things. So there's just that element not great, and just feels bad. To be part of giving more information to another entity that they don't need. They're accumulating, over accumulating, hoarding the data. So that part was moral, as well as like, hey, I want to own the relationship with my customer. What if AdSense rates drop in half? Just as a businessman, like trying to reduce risk, I think it's also like good to have the direct relationship with your customer. So for us, we've tripled our revenue 3 years in a row. So we're selling direct sponsorships, and right now about 60%, 65% is a 10 pixel tall yellow banner atop every page on the site. And the idea there, the incentive is the top of the site is something I want to make worth more. That means more people come, more people see Hacker Noon at the top, and then 10 pixels go to somebody else. And we have the exact same incentive to, make this a better site. So and then the secondary ad is the brand publishing and absorbing all the corporate blog posts and press releases of the Heroku's, basically the top 1,000, tech companies in the world. We all want to be a trusted voice where they can tell stories. And then what we do, called the Brand as Author program. And instead of saying it's David at Hacker Noon, we just say it's Hacker Noon or Heroku or Indeed. And they publish, this is an official statement from the company, and that's news. It's new information on the internet, or information they want more widely distributed, and it was paid to produce by the company. So instead of saying like, having their name and saying I'm writing about the company because they pay me, we want the company to be the author and get the accreditation, because they are responsible for the thing existing. They're responsible for that content existing. So to me, the proper accreditation is to make them the author. So that's how we want to do it. And corporate blog posts, like smart people put a lot of time into those. How to build this, why we're making this decision. And that element is something like, it's quality information if you care about that industry and that business. So I think it's a better ad than trying to convert them directly to buying, or to put something like that's irrelevant. At my core, I think ads should be by relevancy to content and not by my personal information. Like when I walk into a store, I don't want you to know my social security number and birth date. What I want is I've expressed intent in this type of content. So show me, that type of thing to buy. So I think that's a better way that it would work, because you have to give up some pixels on your site to make money. It could be a paywall and you block the access to content. It could be, plugging in AdSense, or it could be a related good. And so the other way we're experimenting with is doing ads by tag. So every story has 8 tags. A sponsor can buy a certain tag, and then at the end, they get a little promoted story. So after we've delivered the value of a full story, and then more context about the person, call to action for the writer, then at the end of the page, when we recommend more stories, the first story will be promoted, and then the rest are curated by what we think is most relevant to this story. So that way it's, I'm kind of most excited about that because it's not giving up much pixels and it's bringing something very relevant. Because it's like if you're, and even there's really good use cases in tech because like an open source technology, that's something where a company gives away to grow adoption. So they're giving away something of value so you can build with it, but they need more people to build on it. So that's a good flywheel, because then you're getting a user that is already learning about coding that type of thing, and they get to the end and you can have free related stories or this tool that's related to the thing you were just reading. So that's kind of where I want to get to with my site.
That's very cool. And I know you guys are doing some interesting things around, or at least maybe it's not necessarily you because you have Coil plugged into the site, but you're doing some interesting things, or you have some interesting ideas around how to pay content creators. Coil being kind of this blockchain version that I'll let you explain. But I think you also believe in this idea of kind of a Patreon for media where audiences can give one-time or monthly recurring tips or kind of subscription revenue to the writers, even if there's no paywall or kind of isolated site, just kind of a generosity thing. I don't think you guys are doing that yet, but tell us about some of your ideas around monetizing and creating monetization streams for these content creators.
Yeah, so I think the content creator, more tools to make money online is going to be pretty exciting. Like there's the content creator and just more distribution as well. So I think there's a lot of good things happening. I really like, what the steps Patreon and Substack have made in terms of, monetizing a direct relationship. I think that's pretty cool. There's still email and the site between it, but it's getting closer, and I think that it's always easiest to get the super fans to pay than it is to have a long-term sustainable system, because the super fans can come and go, and it just also means like if you have 1,000 fans, there's only 10 super fans. That whole middle group can't really give you much in terms of direct money. It's the top group that's going to give you a lot. So with Coil, I think they're looking more at the sustainability of that middle group. So with Coil, you pay them $5 a month, you install their browser plugin, and then it streams payments to whoever has the Coil meta tag. So you just view the internet as normal, and your $5 is distributed across the internet to the sites that based on how much time you spent. So I think it's a very pure idea that like, I don't want to change my behavior at all. I want to give away equally my $5, or maybe they make a higher fee of like, I want to give 20,000 back to the internet this month and really reward the people. And if I spent all of my time on chat, all of my time on this podcast, it goes right to the podcast. So we allow our writers to put the Coil meta tag. So if a Coil subscriber is there, they can stream, payments. So it's very small. I think it's around 36 cents an hour. So it's not like you're, quitting your job tomorrow to do this, but it does mean like the idea that every moment someone's on my site, I make some money is a powerful idea that ads play into. And the idea that it could also be on a subscription way is cool too, because you want like to capture that middle group. You don't need getting money from your super fans. Like it's not quite enough. You have to have more monetization than that. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And Coil became a strategic investor in HackerNoon. So they own around 8% of the company. So we have a aligned vested interest in a long-term contract to continue this operation of how readers and writers can monetize. And other people are using Coil more aggressively, like in terms of powering their paywall and things like that on their own site, which I get. But with HackerNoon, we want to keep it all content entirely free forever. So that creates interesting, challenges in business perspective of like, you could just throw a paywall on it. It's like, no, not for us. We want to be a place to learn, and you can learn anything about tech on HackerNoon. That's where we want to get to. So, but HackerNoon can be a lot of our contributors. It's like they write 100 posts a year, and 10 of them end up on HackerNoon. The other 90 is their personal site or other sites. So there's like an element there of like choosing, how you relate to the internet, that like when you come to HackerNoon, the main thing is editing and distribution, and getting a better headline, getting an army behind you, getting a domain authority behind you. And that's something you want to keep in your arsenal, but it doesn't mean you want to run your own site that way. So there's stuff where I hope the internet gets to is like the Patreon activities happening on the personal domain. I think that's kind of a more exciting internet to me than like drive all my social media to a new social media site. That doesn't seem like the right solution there.
Yeah, and so this integration with, or I guess formal partnership in some ways with Coil is another step in HackerNoon's path towards this technology company. Don't call me a publisher. What else do you have on the roadmap? I'm just teasing, but what else do you have on the roadmap that you can talk about as you kind of continue with your software development team?
One thing we have coming up is video calls with tech experts. So we're going to be, we want the contributor right now, they control their call to action on the site, and they can write in text and they can link anywhere they want. So people use it for hire me, read my book, check out my company, meet with me for coffee, buy me coffee, and subscribe to my Patreon. People use it for all types of things just like that. But we want to also then start to default some things where as part of the HackerNoon experience, you can just check a box and now you have a page where you can book a video call. And you can say, hey, here's my calendar, boom, boom. And then the transaction happens, the writer gets paid, and we get paid. And so that's something that I don't know how much people will want it. We'll see. The idea of booking on-demand video calls are pretty cool. Like I'm going to use it to learn from the people I want to learn from. I'd rather budget $500 a month and have, or probably not that much because I don't have that much time for calls. But I'd rather do a small budget and just book experts that I respect on the internet that will spend some time with me. I mean, some of that, probably some of the reason you create a podcast. That's how I used the HackerNoon podcast. I just whenever, sometimes it's I want to meet that person. They probably don't want to just shoot the shit with me staring at their computer. But I guess if it records and distributes, maybe they'll want to do it. I had an interview with a Microsoft director last week. I hadn't done a podcast in a while. I was opportunity flow in. I was oh, I want to meet that guy. I want to see him use the HoloLens in person. That's going to be cool. And he's on the other side of the Zoom screen, floating. Everything's floating around in there. So that's fun. But back to the question, just more benefits for the contributor and more rev share with the content creator, I think is kind of a exciting direction for us. So these video calls with tech experts will kind of be a nice little test to see what people want, and so that's, yeah, that's kind of a lot where we're headed, I guess, or not a lot where we're headed, just something I kind of have top of mind because I'm working on it now. And then we also, we've been building slogging, so that's Slack blogging.
Right.
So this app we've just used internally on a single channel guest so far. And what it does is the first line on Slack is the headline, and then all the comments or the threads on it become the story body. So you can kind of propose a question like how to run a marathon, kind of crowdsource a story, and get away also sometimes it can just be intimidating to write a whole blog post where you feel you have to get it perfect and wrap it all up. But if you look at the growth of things like Haro and ways of gathering quotes, I think it's kind of exciting because you can figure out a way to gain value in a sentence or two sentences and kind of capture a little more of what Twitter did, but organize it a little better, or not necessarily better because they have a cool system for organizing too, but in one package story. So with this app, we want to bring more people into it, create more instances, work out all the kinks. We've published 25 posts. When we get to around 100, the plan is to put it in the App Store so other companies could use it, and then have kind of a more transparent form of blogging. Instead of saying, we're announcing this, you can propose why did I choose this framework over that framework? And have your actual engineers comment and decide. Or you could download the app and look back over the last year of all the discussions you had and say, hey, which one markets the company? Which one explains that smart people work here? And explains that we think about these problems in very deep ways. A lot of times you can get that impression in a conversation a lot easier than a paper. So I think we want to kind of play into more of that informalness and how we would talk as opposed to how we would package.
Yeah, it's funny how you called out kind of the strategic aspect of a podcast where, if I try to reach out to somebody to steal an hour away of their time, they might not respond to email, but then you say, no, but I'll record it. And then all of a sudden it's a game changer. So definitely been strategic on my end as well. And with that, I have two questions that I ask every guest at the end of every podcast. But before we get into those last two questions, why don't you give the audience where they should go to follow your work and follow HackerNoon?
So HackerNoon, hackernoon.com, best place to go is the own domain. And we're releasing some new features for readers and writers. So if you can get a custom reading experience, skip the topics that you're interested in, pick your tags. So there's a little more for a reader now over there than just creating an account for a writer. For me, I mean, on my personal site's davidsmooke.net. So it's Smooke like smoke with 2 O's. There's also a composer that has the same name as me out there on the internet. So you can also find Hacker Noon in Wikipedia. So that means we're a real business, of course, because we're in Wikipedia. Talk about trust. Wikipedia went from like, you can't crowdsource an encyclopedia to, oh, that's a real thing. It has a Wikipedia entry. They have really done a really good job.
Yeah, they've done a great job. I was actually impressed recently with how they were promoting their donations too. Really great design and UX around trying to get people. I think their number was $2.75. I'm not sure why they picked that number, but that was the promotion that they were running.
I imagine it also goes by region, right?
Yeah, it probably does. Yeah, I mean, they're dealing in all different currencies. So on some level, if I saw a dollar sign, then that wouldn't be relevant everywhere. So yeah, I'd imagine it's different.
Yeah, I mean, like right now they have such a good editing system and a history of record. Like they've built that technology a lot and they already have so many users. So there's definitely maintenance there and optimization, but I imagine what their product people are doing now is a lot more of where the money is and playing with that UX of the donate button. And you start to think, whoa, that's kind of weird. Like, is that how it should be? I don't know if it is. This is just me guessing because I don't know. Where software can make money, it just finds people. People just find it. So there's a natural thing they would have the best donation bar because it's their whole business.
Yeah, definitely. Well, speaking of making money, question number 1 of my last 2 for you is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
So I'm a huge believer in digital cash. I'm a very big believer in killing the credit card fee. And I'm a believer that those technologies are almost there. So as a whole core, like that is I also don't know why we've reached the point in business that the government should be in charge of the money. That seems like maybe not the best for long-term sustainability of, good business practice. And so that element is really exciting. And like just how much more we can just pay with just our wallets and our, what is it? Apple Pay is just your fingerprint. You're really paying with your fingerprint. It's pretty cool. Bitcoin itself, I look at it as the mascot of that whole thing. So it's always going to have a shit ton of value because it's the first big mascot of this digital cash revolution. So that gets me very excited. And I'm not like a full expert, but I've read thousands of stories on Hacker Noon coming through about cryptocurrencies and elsewhere, obviously too. And Bitcoin just doesn't seem quite efficient enough to like actually power the microtransactions I'm describing. And if it were, it would overload and they wouldn't process fast enough and it would take a shit ton of energy and it probably won't work as the only digital cash system. But that doesn't mean it can't, go up so much in value. I think it's a very strong store of value actually. I think the institutional investment over the last year that has moved into it is really exciting for its long-term sustainability. So those things are pretty cool. So I'm pretty bullish on Bitcoin overall and digital cash revolution as a whole, like 100% in. Like that's going to be just a lot better. And the credit card companies, it's like, why is 2.9% the standard? Like what value did you provide in this transaction that like I needed to always you to just constantly have 3% of me? Like that seems like a lot. So I think that stuff, getting to a world where we could have a 0% transaction fee is a lot of economic value created. I don't think we'll ever truly get to like 0.00, but getting to like 0.1 is still like a really cool thing. If you can, what is the minimum amount of energy you can put into for us to do a transaction between each other? It's a lot of really good technological progress over the last 10 years.
And what do you think about this kind of trend that public companies like Square and Michael Saylor's MicroStrategy And even some smaller startups that I know of have taken their cash reserves, whatever they kind of don't need to spend in the next 6 months to a year in payroll and fixed costs, and whatever their reserves are, they're sitting it in Bitcoin now. What do you think about this trend? Is this like is this just adding risk to what is already a risky game and trying to build a startup, or is this genius, or somewhere in between?
I think the larger the company gets, the more you don't realize it's a financial company at the core. And a lot of the way they're making money is actually finance. So there's some of that like this stuff is already happening. Like these companies are diversifying their assets in so many different ways. It's just like Bitcoin is more of a story. It's more notable. It's not notable to like, move it into gold or premium stocks, but it's like, oh, it's notable if it's into Bitcoin. So some of that's news value of like growing up the cryptocurrency system and just how news is reported. But I mean, and for a small startup, so back to the small end of it, I'd say it's pretty damn risky, and you should probably like avoid it or make it clear to however, if it's your revenue and you've determined you're going to pivot and you're better off being a finance company, and you're going to focus on that, that's reasonable. And if it's an investment, you should probably be really clear with your investors of what you're doing with the money, because like pitching them something else and baiting them and then switching to saying I'm a Bitcoin reserve, is not good. So the startup people, I would probably I would recommend being very cautious. But this middle ground, some of it is decision makers, if they personally hold a ton of Bitcoin, maybe they think it's best for the company too. And some of it is real hedging of risk against governments, like some of the stuff like if you're in an unstable government, or if your government's currency just isn't in a strong position amongst the world, and you evaluate that, getting politics out of how your wealth accumulates can be pretty interesting, or at least getting your local government out of it, because there's still obviously politics that go into cryptocurrency and why people are holding and stuff like that. But I think in general, it's a good trend. Like, I think I'm really excited. I don't know who will make it, but I think the idea of this true stable coin is like pretty cool. But it's like, what is one to you is not one to me. There's always going to be some level of that, but I hope someone gets to like a mass adopt close to stable coin thing. Like that would be really cool. And I guess the other thing with the reserves that I think the structure of Bitcoin did very wisely, and some cryptocurrencies followed and some didn't, is the true limiting of money supply. I think that's where like value can always be measured more accurately if you know the current and future money supply. You can make $1 worth half of what it is today just by doubling the money supply. So that's something I think was really smart in the organization of the system, that like you can mine them, you can grow them, there's going to be a limit, and when it hits that limit, it hits it. And there's no way to, sometimes, maybe the votes can change things on different chains, different blockchains, but the idea of getting to like predictability of money supply means the money demand is more accurate as it goes up and down in my mind. I think controlling the money supply is like, it's just like if you run the bank at Monopoly, that's the simple analogy, but it just changes. It's too much control. You don't want your whole business on that. So I think it's great. More companies holding cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I think when you boil down the value of something like Bitcoin, where people throw out terms like store of value or digital gold, I think what it really comes down to, the real underlying value, if you keep digging, is just clear monetary policy that is enforceable and cannot be changed. Because a lot of these big wealthy people around the world, they don't necessarily need to be growing their money. They really just want to protect their wealth. And that goes for companies and individuals and governments. And you can't really offer that clear of a monetary policy anywhere else, because even in equities, in stocks, for example, Tesla, can come out and issue new shares. And that's basically the same thing as the Federal Reserve printing more money. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really, the value is just, look, there's this programmatic, clear monetary policy. And I don't even know that it had to be deflationary or disinflationary, as they say. I just think the clear monetary policy gives people a sense of ease, and that's where the value is. Yeah. Well, last question for you, David, is are we living in a simulation? Yes or no, or elaborate, I guess.
No, this is real to me. So by that definition, it's real to me, it's real. My dreams are also real to me, not a simulation. When I'm playing a video game, not a simulation because it's real to me. But, there's probably other David Smookes out there. There's other timelines. I always think like, getting lucky in this timeline or getting unlucky. It's like, it's fun. I would like this timeline to continue existing, whether it's a simulation or not. I'm riding this thing out, and it's pretty enjoyable.
So you're thinking like, oh, I stubbed my toe, but it's okay because the thousands or millions of other David Smooks out there didn't have to stub their toe today.
Yeah, martyr for yourself. That's like a new level of narcissism.
All right, cool. Well, David, thank you again for coming on the Credder Podcast today. I hope everybody goes and checks out your work at Hacker Noon, and look forward to you and I talking some more about, ways that Credder might be able to help Hacker Noon, or we might be able to help you guys. But it's been great to meet you through the Mozilla project there, the Fix the Internet campaign, and hopefully we keep the conversation going.
Cool. Thanks for having me on, Chase. Keep going on the direction you're doing. It's pretty interesting. I'll be reading.
Cool. Thanks.